Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of our Trainz route building tutorial series. In this series I'm using TRS 19, but most things also apply to other Trainz versions. In this episode I'm covering tracks and splines. So, let's load the route we've been working on. Okay, so tracks are obvious. They are what trains can be placed on and can drive on. But splines are a bit more ambiguous. A spline can really be anything that occurs in a line. So for example, a road is a spline, or a hedgerow, or a wall, or sometimes even buildings. In Trainz, both tracks and splines work almost identically. The difference is really that tracks have more manipulation tools available to them, and of course that you can only place trains on tracks, not on other splines. So let's add a straight piece of track. To access tracks, click on the Tracks tab on the right hand side of the screen, which is the fourth from the top. For this example I'm using the track asset Tane one track wood. This is a procedural track, which means that junctions are going to be animated, which is a good feature, but it's also quite performance intensive. So if you have a lot of junctions and a lot of scenery and trains, it might be a good idea to choose a track that is not procedural. So let's add the track. To do this, make sure you've selected the track you want to use, and then select the Add Track tool, keyboard shortcut A. Then left click on the train where you want the track to start, and then left click again where you want the track to end. As you can see, we've added a nice, long, straight piece of track. Now let's add a curve to the end of this. To do this, make sure the Add Track tool is still selected, and then left-click within the white circle at the end of the track. This white circle is known as a spline point. Then left-click where you want the curve to end. As you can see, we've added a nice curved piece of track, but our straight piece of track is also curvy now. This is because in Trainz, tracks and splines are smoothed from both sides of a spline point. So the tracks either side of the spline point have both been smoothed. Now to the right side, this is what we want because we want a curve, but to the left side, it should be straight. To straighten this, select the Straighten Track tool, keyboard shortcut B, and then click on the piece of track you want to straighten. As you can see, the track is now straight. But our curve is still looking a bit strange. Now, where the curve is attached to the straight piece of track, it looks fine, but then it straightens out, which is good, but then it curves back the other way at the end of the track. Well, this is because the spline point, the white circle, at the end of the track is also being smoothed in both directions. Now, on one direction there's the curved track, on the other direction there is nothing. So Trainz doesn't know which way to smooth. So let's add another piece of track. Now you can see this curve is still looking a bit strange, so let's straighten this new piece of track as well. Select the Straighten Track tool, keyboard shortcut B, and then click on the new piece of track. As you can see, our curve is now looking much better, but it's still a bit strange because on the right hand side the curve is quite sharp and on the left hand side it's a bit flat. So to fix this we need to move the spline points that we've already placed. So we need to select the Move Track tool, which is here, keyboard shortcut M, and then click and drag one of the spline points until you get the curve that you want. Now the curve is already looking much better, but in the middle it's still quite flat and the curves are still quite steep. So to fix this we would need to move the center of the curve a bit outwards. To do this in Trainz we need to insert another spline point in the center of the curve. To access the Insert Spline Point tool, click on Advanced at the bottom of the panel on the right, and then click on the Insert Spline Point tool, keyboard shortcut I. With this tool selected, click on a point on the track where you want to insert the new spline point, in this case roughly in the middle. Then go back to the Move Track tool, keyboard shortcut M, and click and drag this new spline point to get the curve angles we want. This looks good. Now we have a smooth curve that has good angles. If we wanted to remove this spline point again, we would need to select the Delete Spline Point tool and then click on a spline point. Let's undo this action by pressing Ctrl Z or Z. Now let's talk about adding junctions. To do this, select the Add Track tool again, keyboard shortcut A, and then click on either a spline point or just on any point along an already placed piece of track. So let's add a junction here. Left click on the piece of track and then move the track to where you want the junction to go. As you can see, a junction has been placed with a lever attached. The green and red arrows of a junction indicate which way the junction is set. If the junction is set left, then the left arrow will be green. If the junction is set right, or straight in this case, then the right arrow will be green. Now, you may have already noticed something about this junction. The track at this end of the junction is not looking very straight, and there is quite the sharp edge in this junction. To fix this, you need to straighten the piece of track that is before the junction. So let's select the Straighten Track tool again, keyboard shortcut B, and click on the piece of track that's before the junction. As you can see, the junction now looks much better. Now let's talk about grades, so going up and down hills. The spline points we've been using so far are all non-fixed height spline points. This is indicated by their white color. What this means is that the spline points and pieces of track between them will automatically align themselves to terrain. To demonstrate this, I will add a hill. Terrain tools will be covered in a later video. Now I've added a hill, and as you can see, the tracks are going up the hill, curving around it, and going back down the other side. Now, at first glance, this might look quite good, but if you look again, you will notice two problems. Problem number one is that the track, when going along the side of a hill, is slanted since it's following the terrain. So for this example, I'm going to select a different track. So, for example, Tane track rails only, and I'm going to place this along the side of this hill. Now, if I zoom in, you can see that these tracks are sideways. This is not very good to run trains across. The second problem is that the grades aren't smooth. You can see here that there are these kinks in the track where the terrain grid is. Now, to run trains across this, you want the track to be as smooth as possible. So what we want to use instead of non-fixed height spline points on hilly terrain are fixed height spline points. So let's try that on a new piece of track. So let's go back to the track we've used before. To do this, let's use the Get Track tool, which is here, keyboard shortcut G, and then left click on a piece of track. As you can see, it's brought me straight back to the track that I was using before. Now let's add a straight piece of track going up this hill. At the moment, we are still using non-fixed height spline points, the white ones, but if we select the Set Spline Height tool, keyboard shortcut H, and click on a spline point, you can see it turns yellow, and the track is now no longer following the terrain. You can see it's floating in parts and is partially buried in the terrain in other parts. So it still needs a bit of work to get looking right. With the Spline Height tool, you can also click and drag on a spline point to adjust the height either upwards or downwards. If you want to adjust the height more smoothly, click and drag and hold Ctrl. Now, because we're using fixed height spline points, the tracks can't align to the terrain, so instead the terrain must align to the tracks. To do this, select the Smooth Spline Height tool, keyboard shortcut S, and then left click on a piece of track. As you can see, the terrain has now been brought up to the track. This will also create cuts in the terrain if the track is below the surface. Now, this already looks like a pretty good grade, but if you look at it from the side, you'll see that it is very, very steep. If you know anything about trains, then you'll probably know that trains are usually not very good at going up hills. So for a normal train, a 1% grade is already quite a steep grade. This track is much steeper than that. So let's see exactly how steep this is. To do this, click on the Get Gradient tool and then left click on a piece of track. Now, if you look to the number to the right of the tool that's currently selected, you can see that it reads the grade of the track that you clicked on. At the moment, it says 7.24. That means that the piece of track we clicked on has a 7.24% grade. A 7% grade is very steep for a railway. For context, the steepest mainline grade in the USA is about 5%. At least it was before that branch was closed, but that's beside the point. The point is, we need to lower this grade. So we can do this one of two ways. We can either select the Adjust Spline Height tool and then go over to one of our spline points, click and drag it down. As you can see, the track has now disappeared in the ground. So if we go back to the Smooth Spline Height tool and then click on the track, and yes, you can click through terrain, you can see that the train has been taken down to the track. Now, this method of changing grades is good and useful in many cases, but it has the drawback that you have to eyeball the grade. So if we look at it, it's clear that this grade is still way too steep. The second way we can change a grade is by giving Trainz the gradient we want and then applying it to the track. To do this, click and drag on the gradient value and type in the grade we want. So let's say a 3% grade. This is still quite steep for most railways. Then click on the Apply Gradient tool and then click on the piece of track we wish to change. As you can see, the track has once again vanished in the terrain because the grade has been lessened. So we need to go back to the Smooth Spline Height tool and then click on the track. This grade is still a bit steep for most railways, as I said before, but it is acceptable. Now, if you have a piece of track that has fixed height spline points, so the yellow ones, but you want to get it back to non-fixed height spline points, the white ones, you can use the Remove Gradient tool, which is here, and then click on a spline point. And as you can see, the track is now back to aligning to the ground, and the spline point is no longer yellow. Now let's talk about getting and setting spline point heights. So I'll add another piece of track using the Add Track tool. Now let's see what height the spline points we have are currently at. To do this, we need to use the Get Vertex Height tool and then left click on a spline point or vertex. I'm left clicking on the track vertex or spline point. The number to the right of the selected tool, height value, now displays the height in meters that the spline point we just clicked on is at. In this case, the height is 0 because the baseboard we are using has a default height of 0 meters. Now, if I want this track to be, say, at a height of 10 meters, I can select the height value, which is the number to the right of the selected tool, type in 10, and then click the Apply Vertex Height tool, and then left click the track vertices to set that spline point or vertex to that height. The track is now at a height of 10 meters. Note that this is not relative to the ground, but rather relative to height 0. Okay, so that covers the basics of how tracks work in Trainz. Now there are 3 more tools that are used sometimes, but most of the time you won't need them. I won't go into great detail on these, but I will mention them. The first is track condition. Track condition affects how much Trainz will sway when driving over this piece of track. You can get, set and reset track conditions here, or by clicking on the question mark here and then clicking on a piece of track. The second tool is super elevation. Super elevation, if you don't know, is when in a curve, track is leaning inwards, so that trains going along the curve are leaning into the curve and can thus travel faster safely. To access super elevation, click on the question mark in the Advanced tab, and then click on a spline point or vertex of a piece of track. The third and last track tool is the Show Curve Radius tool, which is just above the question mark in the Advanced tab. When selected, you can hover over a piece of track and it will show you the degree of the curve that you're currently hovering over. So let's place a curve to demonstrate this. As you can see, the curve radius changes as I move the mouse along the curve. Okay, now let's quickly talk about splines. To access the Splines asset list, click on the Objects tab on the right side, which is third from the top, and then click on the Spline Mode tab to switch over to Spline Assets. Here you can see a list of all the spline assets that are installed, including grasses, fences, streets, platforms, all that sort of stuff. You can see that this looks quite similar to the track editing tools, and that is because, as I said previously, tracks and splines are basically the same thing, only that if I open the Advanced tab, you can see that with splines there are far fewer tools available. You can add splines the same way that you would add tracks. You can also straighten them, again, hotkey B, and you can also put junctions in here. If you go back to the Add tool, keyboard shortcut A, and then click on some point of a spline, you can see that it's made a junction, only there obviously is no junction lever here. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful.